Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'd like to welcome you to this discussion about the NATO Summit. Last week, the heads of state from 31 allied countries convened in Vilnius, Lithuania for the annual NATO Summit. According to NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, NATO leaders have agreed that Ukraine will be invited to join the military alliance, quote, when the allies agree and conditions are met. But the timeline for Ukraine to join the bloc is still unclear, and Kyiv wants specific pledges on when and how it can join the defense alliance. To talk about the NATO summit and prospects for a security guarantee for the Ukraine, I'm joined by two experts from the Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik, the German Institute for International and Security Affairs. Dr. Margarete Klein is the head of Eastern Europe and Eurasia Research Division, and Dr. Claudia Major is the head of the International Security Research Division. Margarete, Claudia, herzlich willkommen. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.
I'm very much looking forward to this conversation with you, and I'm sure that there are a lot of directions that we can go in, a lot of issues that we'll touch on. But I thought that I could start by asking you both to share your takeaways from last week's NATO summit. Certainly for me, there were a couple of surprises. For example, after months of blocking Sweden's entry into NATO in the run-up to the summit, Turkey's president, Recep Erdogan, agreed to support Sweden's bid to join NATO. We also saw in recent weeks that Germany is now preparing to deploy 4,000 soldiers to Lithuania. So we're seeing some big changes in the security architecture and security structure of Europe. But let's start with you, Margarete. What stood out to you about the NATO summit?
I think it was quite clear in advance to the summit that there would not be an invitation for Ukraine to join NATO. So instead of an invitation, there was only a reaffirmation of the Bucharest the commitment. And you already mentioned it, tied to two commitments and two conditions, if allies agree and if conditions are met. And I think the first criterion refers to a lack of internal consensus with regard to Ukraine joining. So some countries being very eager to block it for some because of the risk of escalation and because upholding the internal cohesion with regard to defense and deterrence is seen as a priority. So that is the one thing. But the other one is when conditions are met. Well, I think that is the summit result is kind of a disappointment for Ukraine, of course, at first glance. But I think at second glance, Ukraine certainly got something from the summit. And the first is the possibility to join NATO when conditions are met, and allies have agreed quite quickly because the membership action plan has been erased. So this could be quite quickly when the conditions are met. And secondly, NATO supports Ukraine substantially to become ready for accession by funding, and that's interesting, a multi-year program for supporting the transformation of Ukraine's armed forces to NATO standards. And I think a second point is NATO agreed to enhance political cooperation by enhancing the commission, NATO-Ukraine Commission, to a council that is giving Ukraine much more agenda-setting opportunities. And I think what was most surprising was that the issue of bilateral security assurances, commitments, was outsourced to the G7 countries. So this is something interesting. So not being invited for membership, but getting substantially more support. And I think that can be seen quite positively from Ukraine. But at the same time, and that's the last point I'd like to make, is this entails a risk too, because the controversial issue has been postponed, but it will remain, of course. And it will be an issue of the future. And in the upcoming 1 or 2 years, we will run into a circle of a super election year where domestic considerations will play much more a role than they have played maybe at the summit in Vilnius. And this will make it much more difficult for Ukraine to get a quick invitation for NATO invitation and enlargement.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for those points. I mean, I think it's interesting to think about sort of some of the things that happened on the sidelines of the summit, right? I mean, there was a tweet from the Ukrainian president Volodymyr Zelensky where he seemed to really express his disappointment that his hopes had not been met. And yet the very next day, he seemed to really be backtracking on that because of some of the elements that you just described that he got out of it and was able to take away as positives. Do you think that was a show, or do you think sort of his mindset changed? Any insights into sort of what might have been going through his head or the formal Ukrainian response?
No idea what was going through his head personally, but I think that was quite a clever strategy too, pushing the issue of NATO membership very, very harsh, and then getting something out of it. I mean, it's not enough for Ukraine because it was really a disappointment. And we see that more than 80% of the population are now in favor of NATO membership. That has changed significantly in the previous 8 or 9 years. So there was high expectations, but by raising the expectations, I think he put the exact number of pressure to NATO to get something out of it. And I think it's something substantial that he got.
Mm-hmm. So Claudio, what stood out to you about the summit?
First of all, again, thanks for having us here in that format. It's really great. Margarete made the main points. I think if I would sum up the Ukraine decision, I would say I was not surprised, but I'm still disappointed. In the run-up to the summit, you could see that particularly the US and Germany were really reluctant to make any clear commitments that clearly go beyond the 2008 Bucharest Declaration. So it wasn't really a surprise that the formula was so vague, the one you both of you quoted. So it wasn't a surprise, but I still think it's disappointing because even the start of that sentence is, I think it reads something like, we will consider to extend an invitation. So it's so many weak formulas in it, and that again expected but still disappointing. So Margarete made the main point. So just two meta points. The first is I was actually worried because until the day before the summit started, almost all elements of the summit agenda were still not clear. They're still disputed. The regional plans, Sweden accession, the defense investment pledge, Ukraine. So there was, until the summit started, so much controversy inside NATO. And that was worrying. We already had that last year at the Madrid summit. And normally NATO summits are made to display unity to the outside world and enemies and to the inside for allies. Because this political unity is the message that allies would stand up to each other. And if you can't send that message convincingly, also your defense and deterrence message is weakened. So having all those topics disputed until the very start of the summit, I found it very worrying. So the second, and particularly with regard to Sweden, we had that already last year. The Madrid summit, Turkey and Sweden and Finland, that was a last minute solution. The second point that I was interesting is what Margarete already mentioned, is the combination of NATO and non-NATO elements to actually offer a security network to Ukraine. So NATO recognizing that they can do the military stuff, but they can't do the political or the economic stuff. And even the military in a very limited framework, because NATO only offers non-lethal support, so medical support, but not weapons. And they managed in Vilnius to actually find the complementary elements. So NATO, the G7 and multilateral formats, for example, the new F-16 coalition, and all those worked together. And that was for me a really fascinating way to bring the various elements together. If Ukraine wants to have a safe perspective, they need political, financial, economic, and military support. And bringing those various dimensions with various institutions together, I think, was really an achievement. For me, the question coming after Vilnius is actually the one about implementation. If you read those documents, the G7 declaration, the NATO communique, and the others, those support measures are framed as a bridge to NATO membership and long-term security guarantees. They're not framed as a substitute. But I think still some states are still very much tempted to kick the NATO membership can down the road. So for me, the crucial challenge is up to the Washington summit next year and the one in the Netherlands in 2025 to make sure that those are bridging solutions to NATO membership and not a substitute. So it's not that the NATO issue is off the agenda, but it should come back to the agenda. The NATO-Ukraine councils should assess the progress Ukraine is making with regard to reforms. So countries should really make sure that all the measures taken now are a bridge to NATO membership and not a cheap way out or a substitute. I think that's really the key element.
How confident are you that that's what will play out? And I guess the reason why I'm asking that is it sounds as if you certainly see some achievements and some prospects, but it's all very nebulous, right? It's not very tangible. There's not a clear timeline. There aren't really clear guidelines. How realistic is it that by the next summit in Washington next year, or in 2025, we'll have something that's a little bit more tangible?
I mean, first for clarification, even if Ukraine is invited, it doesn't mean it enters tomorrow.
Right.
Because there have been some misunderstandings, at least in the German media, that extending an invitation would mean they enter tomorrow. That was never on the agenda. It's about moving from the abstract 2008 Bucharest Declaration to a more tangible timeline and roadmap. That was Vilnius was all about, and it didn't really manage to do that. So will they be more successful next year? To be honest, I don't know, because it depends so much on the political debates and situation in the US and Germany. The US and Germany were the two countries who were the most reluctant to move beyond the abstract and go into the concrete. In the US, you know that better than me, you have elections ahead. So that's quite an unknown.
An unknown. Let's put it that way.
An unknown, and we don't have federal elections, but we have regional elections in Germany. So this is going to play out. Honestly, I don't know. I think that the pressure from the other states in the right doses would be helpful. If there's too much pressure, like we have seen it in the run-up to the summit, where some countries, I think, were almost trying too hard, that might become counterproductive. So I think the right thing is to focus on really implementing the reforms and building this network put into place by the G7 and on the bilateral level and on the minilateral level, like the F-16 coalition or others, and try to make the best of it. But I have to say that I worry a little bit that particularly the political situation in the US and Germany might not be enabling.
Yeah.
And maybe just one more sentences, and not only because the US is the biggest ally, also because the US and Germany are the key allies when it would also come to actually, in terms of capabilities, implement the defense of Ukraine inside NATO. So you need, as I said initially, you need unity. If you don't have unity in political terms and cohesion, the deterrence and defense message is weakened. So there's no way of actually pushing for membership as long as allies don't agree. So it's internal work that is needed.
Thank you. That's very helpful. I'm curious how each of you sort of sees how the summit was observed from Moscow, from the Kremlin. Margarete, you were talking a little bit about the fact that Zelensky got a lot, but he didn't get anywhere near what he wanted. And I'm wondering whether you think that the fact that Ukraine does not have a clear path to membership right now can be seen as a weakness by the Kremlin.
I think it is been perceived as a weakness because it exposes two factors that the Kremlin can exploit in the future and has exploited previously. The first is division within NATO when it comes to the specific issue of NATO membership of Ukraine and the overarching idea of what are the security threats for European states at all, prioritizing the threats. And secondly, I think Vilnius clearly revealed the concerns about a military escalation of the war beyond Ukraine on NATO territory. And that is something that the Kremlin can exploit as a fear within Western societies between states in NATO, and it will exploit it, I'm quite sure. So the Kremlin will now try to deepen the dividing lines. Disinformation, for example, meddling into elections. We have several elections, not only in the US, but in European countries and to the European Parliament in 2024 too. And I think it will try to steer up the fear for escalation by, for example, nuclear threatening and signaling and being very ambivalent in its signals for getting it outside. And Russia is quite a recklessness actor, so we can be aware that Russia will try to play that card. And when it comes to the perception of the Kremlin towards the West, I think it's interesting that it's quite an ambivalent perception. On the one hand, the West is seen as the most hostile actor ever, as the biggest threat, but being perceived not as a threat to national security, but as a threat to the regime survival of Putin. So national security is subsummarized under regime security. So we don't really are in a position to really to 100% understand what exactly are the red lines for Russia. We can just think about it, but when it comes to regime security in a very authoritarian, neo-totalitarian regime with a lot of intransparent decision-making processes and conflicts beyond the scene that we cannot really grasp entirely. So there is a risk of miscalculation, of course, and the Kremlin will deliberately enhance that that view of being recklessness. So easy to split. And the other thing is, so it's the biggest threat, but on the other hand, the West is seen as inherently weak, divided, easy to split, decadent, post-heroic, so as something very weak, and you can easily exploit it. So I would expect the Kremlin to try to do everything in the upcoming elections to play with that fear.
Mm-hmm. Maybe picking up on that, one of our viewers is curious, and this is, I guess, more a question for you, Claudia, but if you have thoughts on it, Margarete, please weigh in. One of our viewers is curious whether the Vilnius communique actually doesn't provide Putin with an incentive for a forever war, which would prevent Ukraine from joining NATO. I think for all of us, it's very unclear how the war is going to end. And this one viewer would like to know whether that's a possibility.
Yeah, I think quite clearly the Kremlin has now incentives, and it had incentives previously, to prolong the war, because as long as the war is taking on, it seems that NATO membership for Ukraine is on a long way. So the incentive for Moscow is to prolong it. So ceasefire, we can imagine offers for ceasefire, but ceasefire would not be that stable condition that would be needed for NATO to invite Ukraine under current situation. So I think the incentives for the Kremlin are quite clear. So push further risks and try to prolong the war, because until the end of the war, it's to the benefit of Russia.
Another viewer, is weighing in and saying, well, wouldn't the Kremlin have been saber rattling anyway, regardless of what the results of the Vilnius summit would have been? So it maybe doesn't even really matter. Claudia, I'd be interested in your thoughts about what Putin's next steps could be, or what his strategy could be in this.
I'm actually quite happy that I can't look into Putin's mind and head. I think I prefer I can't do that. So I can't really tell you about Putin's strategy, but I think Margarete perfectly outlined the way Russia acted over the last months and years, actually, and how Russia is likely to act. I mean, you find the Russian narratives not only in Western Europe, but you find it in Africa and in other areas of the world about the West being disrespectful and many other things. So I think that all the risks Margarete outlined, I see them too. What I would underline is it's not only a sign of weakness with regard to Russia, it's also, I would say, a very unhappy moment or signal to Ukraine in the midst of a really difficult offensive to do a lot for Ukraine, but not giving this concrete perspective. So literally say, you will make it one day, but we don't know when. And I think that in terms of messaging was not really good. In the same time, something I fear as Western observer, that we should also try not to talk the results of Vilnius down. Because 3 months ago, nobody talked about Ukraine and NATO membership. It wasn't on the agenda. So compared to where we are coming from, this is an enormous progress. And as Margarete and myself, we both said, this kind of comprehensive package they got in Vilnius with the G7, with NATO, with bilateral and unilateral agreements is actually quite substantial. So I think with all criticism, which I myself put on the table, I think we should also kind of, frame it a little bit. I think what we need to do more in the Western debates is to frame and understand Ukraine's NATO membership not as an element of charity towards the Ukrainians because they did so well, so they deserve to come into NATO. But we need to far more and much clearer make the case that NATO membership is in our own EU and NATO interest, and that we benefit from that greatly. Because there will be no stability and peace in Europe within Ukraine that is partly or entirely occupied by Russia. And Margarete made the point that as long as Russia sticks to its neo-imperialist approaches, as long as Russia says Ukraine has no right to exist and waging war is an adequate mean of politics to pursue my political goals, as long as this is the case, there will be no stability and peace in Europe. So having a sovereign Ukraine is in our own security interest. That's for us one of the best security provisions we can have. So it's in our interest because a safe Ukraine is better for our stability and security. It's also, we need a safe framework to assure actually reconstruction in Ukraine. I think the World Bank in February said $411 billion are needed. And that was in February, it's far more now, to reconstruct Ukraine. But only private investors will only come if they have a safe framework. Otherwise, they will not invest. We could see that in the London Reconstruction Conference, where they didn't really queue up to invest. And if reconstruction fails, if maybe the democratic reform process fails, that might lead to instability in Ukraine. So it's in our own interest. Also in terms of reconstruction, also in order to secure EU membership. Ukraine is an EU candidate state country since last year. In the long term, if they enter the European Union at some point, we have an article called 42.7 in the European Union, which is also some kind of mutual defense clause. European countries without the US are not able to defend themselves. So you would also need some kind of secure framework to secure the EU membership. And finally, hopefully, once the war is over and Ukraine won, we have one of the biggest armed forces in Europe, combat proven, that will be there. And I think it will be in our interest of EU and NATO to accompany this army and this country in their future development. Alliances is about friendship, but alliances is also about accompanying or say control. And I think it would be very good to have Ukraine after a war included into Western frameworks in order to accompany their development. So I think it's really important to understand that getting Ukraine closer to NATO is not easy, it's complex, but it's in our own interest. It's not a charity towards Ukraine. I think we need to make that point much clearer in order to really frame the next months as bridging to NATO and not as a substitute to NATO membership.
Those are very good points, but related to sort of this question around alliances, one of our viewers submitted a question that reads that classic alliance theory posits that successful alliances are small in the number of members and compact geographically. Otherwise, there are profound problems of consensus over strategic doctrine, commitment, and defense spending. Doesn't NATO already demonstrate all of these challenges? Isn't NATO already too big? And Ukraine membership in future could seriously risk fracturing NATO. Claudia, do you have any thoughts on how big this alliance should be?
I agree with this analysis. We have it with the European Union and we have it with NATO. I mean, future NATO with 33 member states, of course, if you have unilateral decision-making, it is too big. The question is, what is the alternative? To say, oh, the 33rd member is too much, we stay with 32. I mean, that's ridiculous. So the question is, yes, I agree with the analysis. Where do we go from here?
Yeah.
So I think given that we can't split NATO into two, except, I mean, we don't know how the US is going to develop. Maybe we come to that point. But in the moment, we are not yet. We are not there. So I think we should act with what we have. Having said that, I see a lot of risk with Ukraine joining NATO. Margarete mentioned some. That's a risk of escalation. I mean, Russia will use that opportunity, whether to really escalate conventionally, nuclear, or in hybrid means with propaganda, just as a threat, or maybe really doing it. We don't know because we can't read the Russian red lines clearly. But there's a risk. There's also a risk of NATO's capacity to act. We mentioned already several times today that NATO can only act if all member states agree. And if they don't agree, there might be big problems. I mean, it took us a year to get Sweden into NATO because Turkey and Hungary objected. If we already have problems with Sweden, we can prepare ourselves for quite more problems with regard to Ukraine. Some countries fear that if Ukraine joins, NATO will all be about Russia and nothing else. So forget about the other topics mentioned in the strategic concept, be it China, be it the South, be it climate change or technological development. It will be all about Russia. And some countries don't want that. Other countries fear that Ukraine might import bilateral problems. Ukraine had lots of problems with its neighbors, like with Hungary. So that might come in. So I do see the risk. I also see the big risk of military capacity to act. A new member should add to the security, should not reduce it. So NATO should only accept Ukraine if it's really able to defend Ukraine in terms of capabilities, command structure, plans, and all that. In the moment, that's not the case. So I do see lots of risks related to membership of Ukraine. But I think if you balance the risks and the benefits, for me, the benefits clearly outweigh the risk, but allies have to be creative and flexible in order to make a membership in the long-term perspective possible. And this is where we come to what you initially mentioned with the veto. These are all the questions of can Ukraine that is partly still occupied be a member? At what time, at what moment of time Ukraine can join? If we say only after the war, then Russia might, as you rightly said, might get an incentive to just carry on the war. That gives Russia a veto in Ukrainian NATO membership. And in the end, this war is about free choice of alliances. So I see the risk, but I think we should try to address them and not say, okay, then we don't do it. It's too complicated.
And as you rightly point out, also consider really what the other realistic alternatives are. And this might not be the best option, but it might be the best option of those options that one has available.
Maybe just a very quick point on that. The other options we usually discuss is the Israel model, strong conventional forces, a lot of bilateral agreements from military to technological and nuclear weapons. I don't think that's an attractive version that Ukraine rediscovers or reestablishing nuclear weapons. Other models like South Korea implies a lot of American boots on the ground, which I don't see either. Some people talk about the Taiwan Act, which I think is not something Taiwan is particularly happy with, and which implies a big American commitment. So I think from all the alternatives we have been discussing over the last months or weeks, NATO membership is not the easiest one, but it's probably the most cost efficient and the most stable on the table.
Yeah. A little bit earlier, Claudia had mentioned the collaboration between NATO member states and non-member states and sort of the thoughts around new kinds of alliances and agreements. And one of our viewers points out that NATO plans to open a liaison office in Japan in the not too distant future. Of course, NATO and Japan have had longstanding cooperation, but in the same vein of the previous questioner who was saying that alliances should be small in number and geographically compact, this viewer is curious as to why Japan has not joined NATO, and whether this move would anger Russia. I don't know who might want to take a first shot at that.
For me, it seems this is a bit unrealistic currently, because I think still it is Euro-Atlantic security architecture and where NATO is at the heart. And here I'd just like to emphasize that for a long time, we tended to see Ukraine in kind of a gray zone in between Europe, understood as EU and NATO, and Russia, something in between, belonging to a nowhere land, something like that. And I guess the war against Ukraine, the renewed and now full-fledged war, changed our perception of Ukraine too. I think the mental map that many of us now have, the eastern border of the Euro-Atlantic region somehow is in the east of Ukraine somehow. And if you look into the domestic situation in Ukraine too, as I just pointed out, so support for being integrated and for integrating itself into EU and NATO has boosted since 2014. Ukraine is in a process of, I mean, it's already a done nation, but still it is conceptualizing its foreign policy orientation, and it is now in a clear way, and it has a clear idea. And so if it's about a regional composition of NATO, I think Ukraine is definitely, of course, part of it and not outside in some kind of green zone.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to Japan, maybe Claudia is in a better position to answer.
To be honest, I thought that off the table again, there was some dispute, but I think it has been postponed or abandoned, but maybe I don't have the most recent information. I mean, in the summit in Madrid last year and this year in Vilnius, both the AP4, the 4 countries from the Pacific were also present at the summit. So there is an increased interest in the region. And if you look at the strategic concept from 2022, you find a big paragraph on China and the region. But in the end, it remains the area of the applicability of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization is the North Atlantic. So it remains there. But what I would like to react more to is this: would not Russia take that as an escalation?
Yeah.
And that reminds me very much of the German debate, where very often the first question is, but is that not a provocation of Russia? Is that not an escalation with Russia? And I think that, of course, you have to think how the other one would react. And you have to think about what could lead to an escalation. You have to try to read the opposite. But that should not be the defining element of what NATO or European states are doing. Mm-hmm. So if Russia says Ukrainian membership is an escalation, does it mean we don't do it? So I think you should need to take into consideration Russian positions. But the first element would to think, what are the security interests of NATO states, of EU states, of Europeans? How can we reach that? And how can we deal with the potential consequences? So what Russia wants or thinks or reacts, we need to take into account, but it should not be the defining element. If we take that, remember the treaties that Russia suggested in December 2021, in the run-up to the war, where they suggested that NATO stops the open door policy and takes away all military installations and troops deployed in the EU member states, the Baltic countries and Poland and the others. Mm-hmm. So I think we should really be careful about how much we let others define what NATO wants to do.
So in terms of NATO and where NATO is, in a podcast in the run-up to the NATO Summit, one of the topics that you touched on briefly was leadership at NATO and the fact that Jens Stoltenberg was actually wanting to leave a year ago, was sort of wanting to leave now. One of our viewers is curious what strategic and political implications it might be that the alliance has not been able to agree on a new Secretary General, and whether you have any ideas as to who a new Secretary General could be. And I guess the question I would add to that is what does this say about the inability to reach consensus within the alliance? What would you read into this? Claudia, do you want to go first and then Margarete?
I thought that extending Stoltenberg, who has already been extended, I should add, was what I would call in French la solution facilitée. So that was the easy exit option. Yep. Allies were not able to agree. So you have Stoltenberg, who really was able to take the alliance through so many difficult times. I mean, he was the SecGen with Trump. He managed to survive. Well, he managed that the alliance survived Trump. He was managing Erdogan last year, Madrid, and this year. He was really able to keep the house together in really tough times. So extending Stoltenberg was continuity, safety, yep. And you know what you get. So I wouldn't see that critical. I would rather say this is, I mean, if you have Stoltenberg, then, you know, that's fine. I don't dare mentioning any candidate for next year because we have so many informal criteria for the next SecGen. Should be, if possible, a 2% country. So a country that is spending 2%. That makes the list rather short. It should potentially be an EU and NATO country. So that excludes some countries. I think a big country who choose Brexit learned that, maybe. Yep. It should, if possible, a woman. So you have so many if possible, a former prime minister or heads of state who has really executive experience. So you have this informal criteria, but in the end, it's a highly political decision. And you don't know who will have left office. I mean, Rutte just left office. That was not really planned from what I understood. So I don't know who the natural candidates will be next year. To be honest, I can't tell you. But we know it's a really, really tough decision. And some allies think it should be a big country, not too much from the East. So I think it will be one of those very tough political decisions where everybody will be happy in the end if they found someone. But I don't dare saying who this will be.
Margarete, do you have anything to add to that or?
Not in particular to that, just to the previous question with regard to Russia, just some sentences, because I think it's really worth mentioning that Russia's aim with regard to Ukraine are not limited to Ukraine. They are also on the second level, it's about rewriting the European security order that was established after the Cold War. So what Claudia mentioned, the treaties, I think it's really worth mentioning it because it means that we somehow misunderstand the concept of buffer zone of Russia. We tend to argue that Ukraine is a buffer zone and so something like that. But if you really read the Russian articles and Putin's statements, so the post-Soviet space is a zone of influence where Russia should be the hegemon. And the buffer zone is the eastern part of NATO. So it targets directly within NATO. And NATO should be split into a classical military political alliance up to the eastern border of Germany. And from the eastern border of Germany until the eastern border of the Baltic states, it's kind of a buffer zone, demilitarized. So I think it's worth mentioning that idea that Russia has with regard to rewriting and the European security architecture.
Well, so as a follow-up to that, you know, one of our viewers is curious to what degree long-term solutions were discussed at the NATO summit in terms of establishing a sustainable European architecture. What could that look like from your perspective, Margarete, and then maybe from yours, Claudia?
I mean, these are very old discussions. They have mostly been hotly debated in the 90s and 2000s. But I think since Russia invaded firstly into Ukraine in 2014, the idea of establishing a new European security architecture with Russia have shown its clear limits in implementation because Russia is not interested in joining a common European home based on the idea of a rules-based order. I mean, of course, rules-based when it comes to a hegemonic order of Russia, but not into a rules-based order that we have established with the Charter of Paris, for example. Mm-hmm. So I think we should, when it comes to discussing Ukraine's future, maybe we should also make the point that, yes, of course, Russia should be part of that order too, but it must be a Russia that has profoundly changed domestically on two levels. Domestically, when it comes to the authoritarian, neo-totalitarian tendencies, but also with regard to its role conception and its idea of militarization of foreign policy, meaning essentially that military means are legitimate, efficient, and effective in pursuing one's own interests. And as long as that strategic belief or belief system has not changed, Russia's intentions will remain aggressive, independently of how far Russia can uphold its military capabilities. But that strategic culture has to change, and cultures change usually very slowly through a process of socialization or a profound external shock. And a clear, crushing defeat for Russia in Ukraine could be a starting point for changing that narrative of militarization of Russian foreign policy. Not saying that definitely it will, but it would be one of an external shock elements. And then we should make clear that when Russia has changed, of course, the door is open for Russia to join a new Euro-Atlantic security order. Of course, Russia is partially and is a European state when it comes geographically, when it comes to culture, but when it comes to the political rules that we have established as a rules-based order, it sees itself now outside of that order.
Claudia, do you have anything to add to that in terms of thoughts about the future of the European security order?
I totally agree with Margarete's analysis. Maybe just two things. I think it's really important to again and again underline that the long-term objective would, of course, be to again have a cooperative security order with Russia. That would be the best case. But we should also be very clear, given to what Margarete just outlined, that this is a very, very, very long-term perspective. In the research, we say that strategic cultures, so a way a country behaves in foreign security policy, change over a generation. And as Margarete said, as a process or as a result of a shock. But that means that it will take us a long time, and it's not even sure, in order to re-engage in a more cooperative way. And only if Russia changes its position. There can, of course, there is obviously something in between a cooperative security order and a war. So the question is, what are the steps in between? But I like to talk about this European security order as a house, as we often talk about the common European house. Right. And this house is destroyed. It's totally destroyed. And we don't have the plan to rebuild it. So the question is, how do we rebuild something if you don't have the material you need and you don't have the plan? And this is where we are now. So we have to understand that this will only be possible in a very long-term perspective after fundamental change in Russia. And even then, that will be baby steps, starting with tiny, tiny, tiny confidence measures. And we will only slowly be able to kind of rebuild some kind of interaction. And as much as it might sound very pessimistic, but I think it's better to make it so clear that this is not something that is going to happen after a ceasefire or after a peace treaty. This will take years and decades. So it's not coming anytime soon. And if you add the necessity of reconciliation, of punishing war crimes and all that, what Russia did in Ukraine, this is going to be an extremely painful process. We don't have many examples of successful post-war work. Germany probably one of the good examples, but that's one of the only also.
But building on that, I guess that brings up another topic, given this incredibly long time horizon that you're describing, and given the complexity and difficulty that both of you have presented, we need some action now. Ukraine needs some action now. And I guess the question that I have is short of NATO membership, how can security be guaranteed to NATO? Claudia, you had talked a little bit about different models that are being considered, but I guess I would be very interested to hear from both of you what your recommendations would be for the best path forward to try to provide some sort of security guarantee for NATO, or if you even think that that's possible under the current conditions.
Maybe I just start, and Claudia, you can then jump in. I think it's not about guarantees when it's not a membership, because it's just security commitments, and there's security assistance that can be everything. And then there is commitment, meaning that you have a clear goal and you have kind of a understanding that you like to pursue that goal with clear, tangible steps. So a sense of commitment to that. And this is something different from guarantees, because guarantees can only be defense alliance, demilitarizing Russia, very unlikely. And as we pointed out before, the third option was renuclearization for Ukraine. So everything beyond is something like a commitment, but it's not a guarantee. But there are several concrete steps that could lead to that, giving more commitment in security assistance to Ukraine. That is, first of all, time frame, making clear that programs are not only for a year, but have a multi-year perspective, and that there is a guaranteed financing mechanism to underpin the commitments that you make, and that they cannot be reversed easily when there is a change of government into one or two countries. So it must be quite clear a commitment. And then it should be a comprehensive approach, not only military security, but it should be intertwined with reconstruction efforts, financial underpinning Ukraine, and economic reconstruction and political cooperation, because everything is intertwined with each other. So if you don't make progress with regard to reconstruction, as Claudia pointed out, might have negative consequences domestically, might undermine the idea that you can win against Ukraine. So it all is connected, and therefore it's not only about the classical military pillar of security. And then maybe Claudia.
I very much like the difference or the explanation Margarete gave between commitments and guarantees. You could put it in the kind of lessons learned from Finland, Sweden, and Ukraine. If you are a partner, you get support. If you are an ally, you will be defended. And I totally understand that Finland, Sweden, and Ukraine don't only want to get support. They want to be defended. They want that other countries help them if they are attacked. So this is, for me, the big difference between commitments. You get something, and guarantees, you're an ally, and we will all come and help you. And that's a crucial difference. In addition to the point that Margarete made, I think there are three things Europeans should do now. The first is to really strengthen Ukraine as much as possible in a clear bridging perspective. It's not about a substitute to an MSA, but what can you do to move from commitments to guarantees? And that means getting Ukraine closer to NATO, as happened in the Vilnius Summit, getting the NATO-Ukraine Council, and getting the multi-annual support programs and that. But it also means for the military support, get the other countries in. And that's the minilateral formats, which we have seen with the G7, with the F-16 coalition, with French deliveries, new American packages, new German packages. So strengthening Ukraine in all the various formats we have seen in Vilnius, NATO, G7, smaller formats, in order to really strengthen them militarily as much as possible. The better Ukraine succeeds on the battlefield, the closer it comes to NATO membership. So that's why the military support is so important. So first basket, military support. The second basket is to weaken Russia as long as Russia sticks to its neo-imperialist approach, questioning Ukraine's existence and thinking that waging war is a mean of policy. So as long as it sticks with that narrative, it's about weakening Russia in a way that it can't rebuild its military potential. So that's about sanctions, that's about hole in the sanction technologies and all that. And the third basket, which we tend to forget, that's about strengthening our own resilience, deterrence, and defense. In terms of building the own European or transatlantic armed forces, modernize them, but also in terms of resilience, preparing our publics for the NATO debate, explaining what we did earlier, why NATO is not a charity, NATO membership is not a charity to Ukraine, but in our own interest, and addressing the Russian propaganda in our public spaces, filling the loopholes for financial transactions and all those organizations who pretend to be NGOs, but actually are state controlled by Russia. So I think this triple approach, in addition to what Margarete said, strengthen Ukraine as much as possible, weaken Russia as long as it sticks to its narrative and strengthen our own resilience, deterrence, and defense are key to bridge the current time from the current moment of assistance to the long-term idea of guarantees. But that requires, I mean, their Vilnius was a really good start, and I insist on that, so that this interaction of G7, NATO, and mini and bilateral was really an excellent package. Again, implementation, it's all about implementation in the long-term perspective.
So given where things stand in the conflict, and given this long timeline that both of you have focused on, how concerned are you about the war in Ukraine just becoming a hot frozen conflict? Obviously the fighting will continue as it is at the moment, but will it continue to garner the same amount of attention across Europe and in the United States, in the West? Margarete, maybe you can go first.
Yeah, I think Russia's aims are still maximalistic when it comes to the war against Ukraine. It's about denazifying, meaning essentially destroying the idea of an independent Ukrainian nation, and demilitarizing, meaning essentially a country without an ability to self-defense itself. So this is a maximalist goal that we've seen, and now that Russia has proclaimed annexed 4 other regions beyond Crimea, this is enshrined into the Russian constitution, so there is no going away from that. So Russia's policy is always offensive because it has not yet conquered all the 4 territories. So until that, it is still definitely offensive, and it will stay offensive because it is a maximalist approach from Russia. So here I think from Russia, we can expect something like tactical steps. Meaning, for example, when it comes to the election cycle in 2024, offering some kind of ceasefire, engaging us in debates about, yes, this could be an option, but meaning, and we know the experience that Russia has with the so-called protracted conflicts, we don't call them frozen conflict because they are not frozen. So meaning there is a long experience in managing protracting conflicts, making them hot if you need to make them hot, and then something like a cooling down phase. But that doesn't mean that the conflict has been solved or that it is in Russia's interest to solve it. It's in Russia's interest, the so-called idea of controlled instability, of controlling a conflict in Russia's interests. And that is something we should be prepared for. Though the only solution would be for Ukraine to liberate as much as possible from its territory that it can now, because once you have a ceasefire, I guess the debate in some of the European countries will change a bit, because then it's like something, now we can just have a pause, the worst is over. But when Ukraine then tries to again liberate some part of its territory, it will be seen as an offensive power because it has broken that fragile ceasefire. So this is, when it comes to the narrative, a very, very sensitive moment for Ukraine. So currently, I think the best way is to support Ukraine to liberate as much of its territory as possible in order to bring Russia to the negotiation table in a position where Russia really is interested in negotiation as an content, but not as a means to just play by time and make disinformation with regard to Western countries.
Claudia.
I very much agree with Margarete, and I think the crucial point you already made, Margarete, is that in the Western states, we have the political support in the long term to exactly do what you mentioned, kind of support Ukraine as much so they can actually force Russia to the negotiation table. The political support is a tough one, given that we have elections in the US, elections for the European Parliament, for the UK, and then for many other European countries upcoming, and we don't know how this will play out in the elections. So I fear that the support is not, that the support might weaken. And in military terms, the Europeans and the other international partners, they have also others like Australia or Japan, not so much Japan, but Australia and others, we have very much reached the end of our stocks. And the reboost in industrial terms, so the activation of the defense industrial potential came too late. This is one of the reasons why we're talking about cluster ammunitions, just because the Western countries were too late to actually launch or improve the production. So what I fear is weakening political support on the Western states, and actually there's not much more in the short term we can do in political terms. And if we mirror that with the Russian side, Russia is preparing for a long war. Politically, they frame the war as a conflict with the West, not only against Ukraine, but against the West. In economic terms, they prepare for an economy of war, and in military terms, we had other mobilizations and all that. So the framing is a long war because Russia apparently believes it can outsuffer the West, and that in the end, Ukraine for Russia is more important than for us. And I think it's that timing element which worries me so much, that in the long run, or Russia thinks it prevails in the long run, and the Western states have to increase the support, as Margarete rightly said, in military and political terms in the short run. And that's a really tricky one. So the longer it goes, the more you have the fatigue elements Margarete described, and the more we come back to what I initially said about the necessary resilience in our Western society, not only resilience and kind of defending ourselves, but actually maintaining the support on a high level because it's in our own security interest. And this is getting more difficult the longer the war goes.
Yeah, and it's certainly has seemed on and off again throughout the course of this conflict that each side has sort of felt that time was on its side, or that it could benefit from extending the war in one way or another. But the longer it drags out, the more it really seems like Russia is the beneficiary of it dragging out, and not Ukraine at all. And I think that's one of the big challenges that we face as well, because this is going to be a long, protracted conflict. As a closing question, perhaps one of our viewers just submitted a question saying that if Moscow were to signal that it wishes to enter negotiations, should it be Kyiv alone which decides when the negotiations should take place? So, Claudia, you were nodding, so that's a clear yes.
Yes.
And Margarete.
I mean, who else should decide that?
Right. I mean, I think that the international community is obviously watching on the sidelines and is supporting Ukraine, but is not there. And so this ultimately does end up being a decision for Ukraine to decide when and where. But of course, this is based on a premise that Moscow might signal that it wishes to negotiate, which I don't imagine would take place anytime soon.
I mean, that could be a tough one, as Margarete said. If Russia would now say, let's negotiate based on the current illegal annexations, that would be not negotiation, that would be a capitulation for Ukraine.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is how the West would react. And I think maybe what was hidden behind the question, I don't know, but that would be my educated guess, is the question: if Western support stops, financial, military, humanitarian, Ukraine will certainly not stop fighting, or I guess they will not stop fighting, but they will not be able to pursue the liberation of the territories. We can see that in the moment with the lack of air power. So I think the question, yes, of course, Ukraine decides when they negotiate. The question is, will the Western states be able to bring Ukraine in a good position of negotiations or not? Or will they force them to the negotiation table because there's not longer political willingness to support? I think that's the tricky questions behind for me.
And I think there's another issue to mention, that Russia, of course, wants to have a negotiation process where Ukraine is something like a minor, not only a partner, the object of the negotiation, but the subjects should be the US, Russia, or somewhere else. So you decide about the fate of someone that you see as part of your hegemonic proclaimed sphere. And exactly through the format of negotiations, you want to produce a reality where your rules of great powerness in the idea of the 19th century are fulfilled. So this is about the format too.
Yeah.
So clear signaling.
Yeah, clear signaling. Exactly. Margarete, Claudia, herzlichen Dank. I think we covered a lot of ground. Obviously, there's a lot more to talk about. And unfortunately, this is going to be an issue that is with us for some time to come. So I hope that we'll have an opportunity in the future to continue this analysis. But I really appreciate your insights on the summit, but also on the situation in Ukraine. So many, many thanks for this conversation.
Thank you very much.
Thanks for having us.